Hello internet friends, Napiet here, fresh from watching Raph, Koster and Rich Vogel's GDC Postmortem for Star Wars Galaxies. Very interesting stuff. Anyone who is familiar with Raph's blog, where he has talked about Star Wars Galaxies before, or read James Crosby's excellent Galaxies Remembered book, will be familiar with a lot of the things that were covered in the presentation, but there's nothing quite like listening and watching the actual devs in real time. You can get a sense of what their emotions are and what their feelings are about these various stages of the game. So first of all, what they talked about was basically how the game came to be, that the team was working on Privateer Online, and that's kind of interesting in that it's a space simulation, and how the development for Galaxies actually panned out in the end. It didn't launch with space at all, and that came later with the Jump to Lightspeed expansion. So kind of strange how the game had this very impressive demo early on, Wing versus TIE Fighter, that was impressed Lucasfilm, but actually that side of the game wasn't what came first. They had 2.5 years to produce the game, which is not long enough in a development cycle of any MMO. Even these days, it takes much longer than that to fully polish an MMO. But at every stage, they were under immense pressure to get the game out by this set-in-stone deadline that was looming all the time, and even had to get, additional people in towards that as that deadline loomed to get something out there for people. But I think what was most interesting as a gamer is that the devs were well aware of the problems and what was going to happen when it actually launched. But you often feel like, if you're involved in the forums and the development of a game and you're following it very closely, which I was with Star Wars Galaxies, that almost the problems that you're highlighting as a player, be it through testing, through being a participant in the beta, that the devs really aren't listening. It's not true. The devs are listening and they're well aware of the problems, but sometimes there are other factors at play, and even though they know that things need fixing, they've got this hard deadline looming that can't be changed, and they've got to launch anyway. And Vogel was very transparent about the fact that that poor launch was something that can't really be remedied. Once the game is out, you have that one launch window, and if you don't make it and you don't give a good first impression, what he was saying was you only get one launch. And if you screw that up, you're never really gonna hit it big, because you never get a chance to do that again. We think about things like No Man's Sky and maybe Final Fantasy XIV that have really turned it around and brought the game back. And Vogel was saying that you're never going to get to those high numbers if you don't get it right in first out of the gate. But I think actually Final Fantasy XIV is an example of how, when the devs really do put the work in and realize that something has happened and it's gone wrong, that you can turn it around and you can actually become hugely successful. But I think in the case of Star Wars Galaxies, given that poor launch, actually to pull it around in that Final Fantasy XIV way, you really have to have the backing of everyone. Everyone at the studio has to realize what's gone wrong. And I think but as they talked about the various pressures coming from the publishers and Lucasfilm, everyone has to be on the same page, I think, basically. And there were lots of conflicting ideas about what needed to be in the game. One of those being the need for it to be more Star Warsy and to fulfill that Star Wars fantasy, which both developers were candid about and saying we didn't really fulfill that. What we did fantastically well was the sandbox elements of the game. And even though things were broken in, it was buggy, and they'd made a poor first impression, actually the reason why that early period is considered a golden age was because there were some things that the game was doing very well, and that was the sandbox and the social aspects, and the things that they were made fun of at the time, such as dancing and musicianship, are actually the things that people look back on most fondly. A lot of the things that Star Wars Galaxies did well were actually on the right track. The poor launch and the missed opportunity in terms of fulfilling the Star Wars fantasy kind of overshadows the elements that Star Wars Galaxies did well, which are these social aspects and the economy, which have actually been picked up and are a big aspect in a lot of successful games now, such as Roblox and Minecraft. It turns out that people do actually like to just live in a world and socialize and leverage those peaceful. That was an interesting choice of words from Raph Koster, the peaceful aspects of playing a game, and I absolutely agree with that. And it seems like the current trend in a lot of sandbox and creative gameplay is connected with that. They were talking about how the housing system is a good example of that and how successful that was in terms of the cities that were built, but also the room for creativity that the players had in 2003, which is something that I think a lot of younger gamers now are craving in games like Minecraft and Roblox that Galaxies was doing all those years ago. I think they're absolutely right to point it out, and it's kind of sad that it's gone down in history as, because of the NG and because of the poor launch and the rushed development, that kind of overshadows a lot of the things that the game did very well. We're well aware of the Jedi system and how that was needed to be in the game and the various ways that they tried to do it, and how ultimately it became something that drove players away from the game, quite apart from being a draw, the poor implementation of that. But a lot of that was to do with the fact that, again, there are certain conflicting dictates coming down from above, in that, you know, we want Jedi in the game, that's a big draw, but you can't change the time period. In the time period, Jedi was supposed to be very rare, so can we change the time period? No, you can't do that. Can we get rid of Jedi entirely? No, we definitely need Jedi in the game. Can we make Jedi less powerful? No, they need to be hugely powerful. It's like you've been given an impossible task there, and ultimately, given the limitations of the amount of data that can be tracked in online games, particularly in 2003, this kind of complicated system that they had for unlocking Jedi became a very simple master 5 skills, hidden skills from the player, and then you will unlock Jedi. What that did was ultimately lead to a lot of people abandoning the things that they liked doing in the game in order to grind for Jedi, which they use this word churn, that churned people out of the game, because it's such a desirable thing that people want to do. And so the dancers and the doctors and the politicians who are busy living their Star Wars lives in this sandboxy game, which is the fun part of the game, abandon doing that in order to chase Jedi. But it was interesting to hear the developers talk about that and how there are mixed messages. They have a sense of ambivalence about some of the things that the game did well, but it's gone down in the annals of history as one of the worst MMO launches of all time. The NG launch, which kind of trumps everything in terms of newsworthiness, and it's a negative story, certainly initially with the NG, and how now they look at it and are not sure exactly how to feel, and that's how the developers feel, but that's how, as a gamer, I often feel. Don't know about you guys who play Star Wars Galaxies, but often someone who is perhaps not as knowledgeable or knows quite as much about it will, or maybe they do and they just have a different opinion, and it's a shame that we always have to have this repeated dialogue kind of education and reevaluation with people who are set on the idea that Star Wars Galaxy shit the bed. Yes, it did in a lot of ways, but also it did something fantastically well, and it's frustrating as a player to try and explain that to people, and also for the devs who have to acknowledge the mistakes that they made, but also maybe reevaluate the things that were done right and become very popular in the intervening years. The technical aspects of the game, the pushing the boundaries of what was possible at the time, was interesting to hear about the procedural and fractal generation of terrain, which allowed for very spontaneous missions and events that could crop up as players wandered around the universe. The new systems that they had to develop in order to create these vast worlds that had so much data, that they had to stream the worlds dynamically as players moved around them, because there was no way to store that much information statically on the disc. It came kind of streamed to the players as required as they moved around the universe. That was all cutting edge in 2003. The amount of customization for characters, something that games even now, I've just played New World from Amazon Studios, and They certainly don't have a lot of customization in terms of character faces with sliders and fine tuning of features and things, and that's something that Galaxies had all those years ago. But in order to get things ticking over faster in the live game, companies generally try to cut back on that and give the servers a break and give people's hardware a break. And Galaxies was always seemingly trying to be at the very cutting edge. There's something to be said about that, you know, looking at it and thinking, well, that was certainly amazing, and trying to give the players options like that, but maybe there are lessons to be learned in terms of how ambitious to be. And Raph Koster was saying, you know, maybe we tried to do too much that was new, and we should have maybe done one or two things that are new and not tried to reinvent the wheel with every aspect of the game. Initially, they were looking at using the EverQuest 2 engine, which was in development at the same time as Star Wars Galaxies, and instead they decided to create their own engine. And you know, whether that was a right or wrong decision, I think it was the right decision, because they wouldn't have been able to do a lot of the amazing things that they did. But still, maybe then that would have freed them up to put more content in the game, which was something that they touched on, the lack of content, and that was something that people left the game because of. There was not enough to do in the early stages of the game. It seemed like they learned a lot from the development, and Rich Vogel was talking about hype and how that can be counterproductive, and the lessons that he learned in terms of coming to players too early with your design for the game, and if you do that, it gives players too much of a window in which to fill in the gaps, which I think is interesting, very insightful. It's kind of, and games still make that mistake today. And what happens is, in the interim, while you don't have any new information because you've told players about the game too early, they have years essentially to fill in the gaps with their own expectations, and that leads to an exaggerated sense of what is coming down the pipe. We see that in games like perhaps Star Citizen and stuff like that, that's been on the slate for so long, and player expectations become so great that is it even possible to ever fulfill them if you give too much information too early. But they were also very progressive in terms of bringing players on board and shaping allowing players to shape the development of the game. That's something that I remember anecdotally as a player. I never got the chance to go to the studios and talk to the devs, but some players did. The Jedi Council, they called it, of players who were able to give them an idea of the community at large and what they felt, and that was very progressive for the time. And it'll be interesting to see if that is repeated with Raph Koster's new game that is coming up from Playable Worlds, whether they do that. I think there are pros and cons to that. Players can be amazingly insightful, but also they can strong-arm dev teams if they're too conscious of pleasing the vocal minority and not, you know, strong enough in their vision. So there's a tightrope, that kind of a balance to be sought there, isn't there, between knowing what you as the developers see as your vision, but listening to players who are obviously important in terms of how the game grows and is built. They talked about the pet system, which was kind of interesting. Rich Vogel mentioned something about being able to train a pet so that it's either good or bad, aggressive or a peaceful pet. That's something that I can't actually remember. I can't remember that being in the game, that you were able to train it so that it had a kind of a personality. But how ultimately that was one of the systems that suffered when the NG came out, and that's one of the things that we've talked about on this channel and with other information about Galaxies. This kind of fact that the various teams were in conflict a lot of the time, and what was desired from the game was never consistent. So that system that was lauded and enjoyed by players at the time was ripped out of the game for the NG. And although they mentioned how after the NG subsequent teams did come on board and added a lot of the sandbox features back into the game, it was good that they mentioned that, because it's a big factor in the ultimate legacy of the game and the success of the later game, which is the one that I play. Even though I'm an original Golden Age player, I played every stage of Galaxies, and the one that I ultimately like the best is the latest version of the game, the one that it was when it closed. I'm glad that they were candid about that, and it's good that now with hindsight, we can talk about these things more freely. They were even go so far as to mention the emulation scene now, which is gratifying for people who feel that that is a valid thing for people who still want to play the game, because for a long time it was taboo and no one would go officially on the record talking about the fact that there are emulators out there, and they were very candid about that and talked about them and how fantastic it is and amazing that the teams are still developing. They even mentioned the Star Wars Galaxies Legends Bespin launch, which as a high point for emulation. So I'm glad there's a kind of gradual softening. I'm sure things have changed and they're more free to speak now that kind of SOE is no longer a thing, and I think the license has moved on and stuff like that. It's nice to see it. If you're a professional game developer, you have to be careful in terms of emulation, because you don't want to sanction it, because it can come back and bite you in the ass, basically, because you're giving everyone and their cousin license to emulate your games. That's a bad idea. You need to keep some kind of ownership of what you're doing, and you can't just take things that people have made and do what you like with them. That would be crazy. But I think with hindsight, and as games become basically, I mean, abandonware is a strong word, but it is. It wouldn't exist without the emulation teams. It means that the developers are more free to speak about it. And I think if a game is not actively being developed for anymore, and no one is making a profit on the back of other people's hard work, then it's something that is, in terms of game preservation and the history of games, and just for people who enjoy playing these games, it's good to hear the developers supporting that and being appreciative of it, as we as players are obviously hugely appreciative. So it was a very interesting GDC talk all about Star Wars Galaxies that I appreciated very much, listening to those original devs. I've done a little bit of histories of the game, so I'll put some links up here if you want to do some follow-ups. I found some archive footage from back in the day to make a little overview of the early development, and I talked about Rich Vogel and Raph Koster and found some old pictures of them from back in the day, so it's nice to compare them to the pictures of them back then and where they are now. And to quote Carrie Fisher, when the cast of Star Wars came back to do The Force Awakens, exactly the same as they were back in the day, just slightly melted, and as we all are as we get older. All right, so thank you for watching this summary roundup. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll put up some links to some more videos about Star Wars Galaxies. I haven't been up yet, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.